Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Ask Avidian podcast. This is Jake Borbidge, Chief Investment Officer with Avidian Wealth Solutions. Let's get started.
Elon Musk's SpaceX will begin trading tomorrow when markets open. The price set, you see it here, at $135 per share, giving SpaceX a valuation of $1.7 trillion.
SpaceX opens at $150. That is an 11% increase on $135 pricing.
All right. Questions?
Quick update today. This is 2 days hence the SpaceX IPO. So wanted to let everybody in on what we're seeing, what we know, and some of the things that are still TBD in our perspective. So as everybody that's not living under a rock knows, SpaceX IPO'd last Friday. It was priced on Thursday, $135. I believe the first tick was $150, meaning the first publicly traded exchange. Friday closed a little north or right around $160. Today, currently trading well north of that. Nice kind of day after IPO pop of around 10%. What we're kind of seeing, we'll see what the market ends today. In market value terms, our valuation on the company would be north of $2 trillion. So that's a little bit higher than what markets were speculating. So I think what we saw is the IPO was priced slightly below the $2 trillion mark at 1.75, began trading Friday, and now today is actually trading above that $2 trillion mark. Keep in mind that a very small percentage of the company's shares are actually listed publicly. But one thing that is relevant is the sponsoring brokers, Goldman, Morgan Stanley, among others, also were able to execute their green shoe, which I think actually happened today. Another $10 to $11 billion of worth, of share value on the market, which was quickly absorbed. On Friday, we saw a little over 500 million shares change hands. So basically, every share that was issued changed hands at least one time. We're seeing pretty high volume as well today. It was north of 100 million shares when I entered the studio to do this podcast, and I expect it to continue to climb throughout the day today. A couple notes on what's going to happen over the next days, weeks, and months with this particular stock, and then some of the other market structures that are going to surround this stock, ETFs, indexes, active fund managers. Most people know that this was a IPO that had a large amount of retail participation. We know personally that the retail custodians that we work with received a meaningful allocation. I've heard between 20 to 30% of all of the shares issued went to the retail marketplace, which is larger than most IPOs. Most IPOs do not have a large piece of retail participation in them. However, most retail investors that indicated an interest in buying shares of SpaceX at the IPO received only a small fraction of their overall allocations. You could probably guess 1 share per 100 shares of issuance was roughly what we were seeing on our side. So very significant reductions in overall allocations based on what people wanted to buy. So for retail investors, if they want to continue to fill that level of interest, they would obviously have to buy in the open market. That's probably part of what's driving the volume today, amongst also that issuance of the green shoe. However, what we think is going to happen over the next, over the coming weeks. So there is a couple angles to observe here. One is on the demand side, demand meaning who is going to be the incremental buyer of shares as time passes. And then 2 is on the supply side. So as we know, at the IPO, only a very small fraction of the overall supply is able to be traded, or we call that float, roughly 4 to 5% of the value of the company or of the shares in SpaceX are actually able to be traded right now. So that's a very small percentage. However, on the demand side of things, only a small percentage of institutional buyers likely are actively buying shares to fill their own mandates. The reason being is that indexes have yet to include SpaceX in their allocations. When they do include SpaceX, there is some attention paid to the amount of shares that are publicly traded or the float that actually kind of reduces the overall weight in set indexes. And so what we expect to see, probably 5 or 6 days from now, we'll see a couple indexes start to include SpaceX as a holding. It's not going to be something that is, extremely broad based, but a few index providers, NASDAQ, Russell, I believe FTSE and MSCI have all indicated that they are going to fast track the inclusion of SpaceX over the next 5 to 15 days. However, those indexes a lot of times look at the amount of float, right? So just because SpaceX is a $2 trillion company doesn't mean it's going to get $2 trillion worth of market weight in an index. That weight is going to be adjusted down by the amount of float. Each index provider has their own methodologies for handling that percentage of float calculation. Some index providers just look at that as kind of the market cap, and other index providers increase that, like Nasdaq on the Nasdaq 100 actually has a multiplier of float to include those shares at a higher degree. And so over the next couple of weeks, we're going to see some of those index providers include SpaceX as a holding. It's not going to come in at full market weight. It's going to come in at a float adjusted weight. That's probably, more in the lines of kind of like that 50 to 150 basis point range. So not a huge holding, definitely not the size of a $2 trillion company in those indexes. And that's really when you're probably going to start seeing some of those institutional buyers, called Blackstone or called BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, right? The funds that are running those large ETFs, they're going to start buying shares on the open market to fill their mandates. They're likely buying some of those ahead of time as well. However, what you're not going to see, so the biggest ETFs in terms of AUM are typically the ones that track the S&P 500. And as we know, the S&P, the index provider, is not including SpaceX in the near term. So you're not going to see those large pools of asset buying. However, on the institutional side, outside of the ETF world, many active managers, as well as many large institutions, are benchmarked to the Russell 1000, growth managers to the Russell 1000 growth. The S&P 500 is a less common active benchmark to benchmark yourself against. And so many of those active managers are going to see SpaceX added to their benchmark in the very near term. And so they will have to make a decision. Do we want to be market weight? Do we want to be overweight? Or do we want to be underweight, which is the same decision they have to make for every other stock in their benchmark. However, they're going on very little information for SpaceX. So even at the I don't know anything decision point, even after analysts start publishing estimates on these stocks, which we saw a couple come out, still haven't seen. I think Goldman and Morgan Stanley are probably some of the big ones. JP Morgan, right, still need to publish their research. But once that research is out, you'll see active managers. A lot of them are probably going to take the initial position of we just want to be neutral and wait and see and learn. But some will probably be underweight, some will probably be overweight, and we'll see some of that deal flow, or sorry, that trading flow as well. So the other side of the coin is the supply side. So we haven't talked about that yet. I think that is probably the area where there's still the greatest amount of vagueness or lack of understanding, and likely because, again, this is a private company moving to a public company. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of institutional owners on the private side that now own the public shares. This is a company that has been private for well over 2 decades. It's a mature private company that's gone through multiple rounds of funding on the private markets. Each one of those rounds of funding, each one of those investors on the private side may have different lockups. And so what we're seeing is a very diverse set of potential lockups starting after Q2 earnings are announced, but going all the way through 365 days out. And so what I expect to see over the next, handful of months and quarters is new supply of shares being unlocked. That means that if you own shares in the private side of the world, you probably aren't able to sell your shares until one of those lockups hits. Once one of those lockups hit, you'll see an additional public supply, which actually increases the float. And so you have two things happening, right? The float increases because private investors are unlocked. They're able to sell their shares publicly. Some of them may choose not to, but they still get counted as floated shares because they could be sold. So you'll see some of those shares unlock, increases the float. That in turn increases the allocation that index providers will calculate because they'll see the float increase, which naturally increases the multiple that they have or the weight that they have on that individual stock. So you'll see natural institutional buying as that supply increases over time. How balanced that supply and demand will be is obviously still TBD, and we'll see that borne out in the price action over the next months, weeks, and quarters. So we do expect to get more clarity on the lockup schedule, at least as it relates to our own clients who have participated pre-market in the coming weeks. But likely, as we watch this stock continue to trade, the additional supply of new shares and then the fluctuating demand is going to be what moves the stock going forward. So last thing to think about, your own portfolios, especially as the story continues to evolve and the market continues to digest new information. If you happen to own SpaceX, and like many of our clients have owned SpaceX for a number of years in their portfolios, you may have a sizable position, and that position likely is going to have some sizable gains. It's not too early to start planning on how to potentially exit that position. You're not forced to exit, but there are a number of different interesting strategies that can help you to, bank losses, capital losses that you can use to offset the gains of your SpaceX position. If you have a desire to learn more detail about any of those potential exit strategies, or if you just want to ask more questions to your advisor, just come check us out at avidianwealth.com.